So diffusion is one method that substances can move, and essentially what it is when you have substances in an area of high concentration, they tend to move towards areas of low concentration. So this is the direction of the net movement. So over here you can see we have the particles really close together because there's so many of them in such a small area, and over here the particles are much more spread out because there's much fewer of them in a much larger area. Here we say there's low concentration, here we say there's high concentration, and as we know, particles, they move randomly. So in this case we're looking maybe at a gas, so these gas particles will move randomly, but what tends to happen, because they're so close together over here, they're going to collide with each other a lot, and essentially they're going to deflect, and a lot of them, or most of them, are going to travel in this direction. Okay, but because the movement is random, we can't say all of them travel in that direction, but we can say the general net movement. So most of the particles will move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, and that is what we call diffusion. Okay, so we can look at this in the context of a cell. So if you have a cell like this, and you put a cell next to it like this, what can happen is particles can diffuse across the cell membrane and actually through the cell membrane into another cell. So if you have loads of particles in this cell really camped out like this, you've got a really high concentration, but you've got maybe 2 particles over here. What's going to happen is those particles are going to diffuse across. You're going to get net movement from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, and that is what we call diffusion. Going to diffuse across this cell membrane. And so a few different substances that we need to know that travel through diffusion in and out of cells are the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this is particularly relevant when you look at the lungs. So oxygen and carbon dioxide in gas exchange, that occurs by diffusion. When you look at waste products from the cells such as urea, so urea from cells diffuses into the blood plasma to be excreted by the kidney, and again that occurs through diffusion. Okay, so that transport is diffusion. So we do need to know some factors that affect diffusion. So the first one we're going to look at is what we call the concentration gradient, and the concentration gradient basically is just looking at the difference in concentrations. Remember, we had 2 areas. We had the area of high concentration and area of low concentration. And when you make the difference between those concentrations larger, the diffusion occurs faster. And so the reason why it's called a concentration gradient is you can kind of map it out over here. On the y-axis, we're going to write concentration. And you've got one area over here, really low concentration, one area over here, really high concentration. Then your concentration gradient is going to be really steep. If instead you have an area over here, which is a lot less concentrated, then remember your diffusion gradient, by the way, is going to move from high to low, so it would travel in this direction from the high concentration to the low concentration. But essentially the same thing can be said here, but the concentration gradient, if we were to draw it, you can see it's a lot less steep. And what this is saying essentially is that the diffusion that happens from the blue line is much slower than diffusion that happens from the green line, because the differences in concentration are a lot less. Okay, so that's why we call it the concentration gradient. The next factor that we're going to look at is the temperature. And remember, we said that diffusion basically occurs because of the random movement of particles. So because particles are moving, then if you make them move faster by increasing the temperature, then the diffusion also increases. Okay, so you get increased diffusion. And the last factor we're going to look at is the surface area. So this is particularly relevant when you have diffusion happening across a membrane. Remember, before we had our situation with our 2 cells like this, and what we're saying is when the surface area that the particles are able to diffuse across is larger, that means you're going to get more movement of these particles, which makes sense. So here, if we have diffusion going on here, but instead if we shape our cells like this, then you can see diffusion can happen across a much wider surface area, and therefore we're going to get much more diffusion on the one on the right hand side. Okay, so here, because you have a higher surface area, then you get more diffusion. And this actually leads us quite nicely on to the idea of surface area to volume ratio. So to understand that, let's look at a single cell organism. So with a single cell organism, essentially is, as you might have guessed, it's just made up of one cell, and this cell still needs to exchange gases, so it still might need oxygen and carbon dioxide to come in and out. And the way it does this is just through natural diffusion through the cell membrane. Okay, so it can get all of its oxygen from simple diffusion across that cell membrane, and it can excrete all of its carbon dioxide again through the same process. And the reason for that is because it's got large surface areas. You can see that diffusion can occur at any of these points, and in particular it's got a large surface area to volume ratio. And what that means is that for the given volume, because it's such a small cell, the surface area is so large in comparison to the volume that it can get everything it needs just through simple diffusion through the surface of the cell. In contrast, if you take a look at a multicelled organism or bigger organisms like humans, so you might have loads of different cells, you have a mass of cells here, you can see now the volume of our cells is a lot larger. So you've got loads of volume in here, but the surface area isn't actually that big because you're covering up a lot of these cells. For example, over here, that's covered, that's all covered. And the idea is you want to get oxygen from the outside and exchange it for CO2 on the other side, right? But because a lot of this surface area is covered up, you don't have actually much surface area for the diffusion to occur. So here you've got a low surface area to volume ratio. And as a result, you need specialized structures to allow for that gas exchange to occur, or to allow for exchange to occur sufficiently so that you get everything you need from diffusion. Where the single-celled organism doesn't need any specialized structures, because the surface area to volume ratio is so large already, it can just do all the diffusion it needs just from existing like that. And so one good example of a specialized structure to allow for diffusion to occur is the lungs. So in the lungs, you have these air sacs called alveoli, or one alveoli is called an alveolus. And essentially these are air sacs where you have, remember, you're breathing in a supply of oxygen, and the idea is you want to breathe out a supply of carbon dioxide. And we'll change that color actually. And so the oxygen comes in, or the air that you breathe in comes in, fills up this air sac. And then you can see on this side we have what we call a capillary. So a capillary is basically a really thin blood vessel, which is about 1 cell thick. Okay, so it's really thin and it aligns kind of the outside of our lungs, and it touches the alveolus or the alveolar like this. And what happens then is you have a blood flow coming through here. So here your blood is basically flowing through your capillary, and air is being exchanged into your alveolus. And so what happens then is you end up having a high concentration of oxygen in your alveolus like this, and a low concentration of oxygen in the capillary, which is next to the alveolus, because remember, this oxygen, which was already in there, is being carried away by the blood flow. So essentially what you get then is diffusion across the membranes of the alveolus and the capillary into the capillary like that. And you get the exact same effect with the carbon dioxide. So because you've breathed out the carbon dioxide, you now have a low concentration of carbon dioxide over here. And whereas because your cells have respired and produced carbon dioxide, there's now lots of carbon dioxide in your blood once it gets to this stage. And so then you get diffusion occurring in this direction. Okay, so you can see how gas exchange is occurring here. So you exchange the oxygen for the carbon dioxide and you breathe it out, and you have that same process repeating itself again and again. And because you have this regular flow of air into the air sacs and a regular blood flow from the capillaries, then that means that your concentration gradient is maintained essentially. So a few ways in which the lungs are adapted for this gas exchange. Essentially, you can say there is a large surface area, or if you want, you can even say it's a large surface area to volume ratio. And the idea is then, as we mentioned before, that increases the rate of diffusion. You can also say short diffusion path. And what we mean by that is essentially over here, you can see that we have very thin cell walls on the alveoli and very thin cell walls in the capillary. And so for the gas to actually diffuse across those membranes is very easy because it's so thin. Okay. Another thing we can say is you have an efficient blood supply. So because our blood supply is quick and being carried away consistently, we maintain a good concentration gradient. Because remember, if our blood supply was quite slow, then what we'd end up with is a buildup of oxygen, and therefore the concentration gradient would be reduced and the diffusion wouldn't be as quick between the alveoli and the capillary. And the exact same concept in terms of the efficient ventilation. Because we're dealing with gases here, we also need the gases in the alveolus to be carried away in exchange. So remember, if the carbon dioxide was just a build up over here, then essentially you wouldn't get a concentration gradient. You need to transport this carbon dioxide away to maintain that concentration gradient and increase the rate of diffusion. Okay, so there are a few adaptations of the lungs, and these can be extended to several different ideas as well in different organs in animals. So for example, the gills in a fish. So one particular one that you might use for the gills in a fish would be the large surface area. They're specifically adapted to have a really large surface area to allow more oxygen to diffuse into them. You can also say the small intestine. The small intestine essentially exchanges nutrients into the blood. So again, you can say there's a short diffusion path, efficient blood supply, things like that. And we could also talk about the leaves in plants. And remember, leaves in plants particularly, they have a large surface area to volume ratio. They're very thin and they are very wide and have a large surface area. You can see from leaves, they're quite big in their surface area. So definitely that is an adaptation. You can also say there's a short diffusion path because they're so thin. Okay, so those are a few examples, and we've looked at lungs in detail, but you should be able to apply any of those ideas to various organs that you might get in an exam. Okay, so now let's have a go at a few quiz questions to recap. Okay, so there's a few questions. Feel free to pause the video and have a go and come back to go through the answers. Question 1 then, name 3 factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So instantly you should be able to say the surface area to volume ratio, the concentration gradient factor. You can just say the surface area, that's also fine. And finally, the temperature. All of those factors affect the rate of diffusion. If you have a larger surface area, a higher concentration gradient, or a higher temperature, that would lead to increased diffusion. And finally, how are capillaries adapted for gas exchange in the lungs? Well, you can say a few things. You can say they're very thin cell walls, which gives a short diffusion path that increases the rate of diffusion. And you can also say they have a increased blood flow. So when you have a large blood flow, that also allows you to maintain the concentration gradient, and that leads to increased diffusion as well. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense, and I will see you guys in the next one.